William McDougall. In 1999, when the 368 group was first started, we were in a situation where Jeff Kennett had proposed a freeway from the eastern, he had proposed a tunnel from the eastern freeway to the city of Melbourne, popping out where the ICI building is, thereabouts. And he lost an election rather unexpectedly, and the new government said, oh, what are we going to do about this tunnel? I know, let's have a study. And so they started a study and they created a community reference group, and they invited community groups to join, and I put up my hand as the representative of the 3068 group to join this community reference group to study what they were going to do about the problem at the end of the Eastern Freeway. And William McDougall was appointed to lead that study. And we were very, very mistrustful of the study. The Public Transport Users Association nominated their representative, Paul Mees, Dr. Paul Mees, one of the foremost transport thinkers and activists at the time, who really pushed public transport way ahead of that generation. And the study said, no, we're not having Paul Mees, we're not accepting the PTUA as a community group, they're a special interest group. Well, we were quite taken aback by that. However, Julianne Bell, who was the convener of Save Royal Park, nominated her representative, which was Paul Mees, and so Paul got to sit on the panel. And it was very, for me, it was an enlightening experience, because we not only had William, but we also had Paul discussing matters at a depth that would not normally have occurred, I think, if we had not had Paul there. And although we were mistrustful of William, we gradually realised it was the government that we mistrusted. And things eventuated. But anyway, to tell that story, please let me introduce William McDougall.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's lovely to see you again. It was quite a while ago when all that happened. I should point out that it was, and as Chris also pointed out, it wasn't actually us, the study team, that had a problem with Paul Mees. It was the Transport Minister, Peter Batchelor, of the time, and so we were as bemused as everyone else at that point about PTUA. But I really enjoyed the process we ended up going through. I'll talk a bit about that more, but I also want to sort of bring you up to date. And we can have a bit of a whinge and a discussion about the parlous state of transport planning, because I think since those days it's only got worse, and a lot worse, in Victoria and Melbourne in particular. So I'll start off really with, I've got 3 sections to talk through, and we'll see how we go. I'll try and leap through some of the bits to make sure we've got time for a discussion at the end and so on, but just want to try and give you an idea about, first of all, some of the scene setting as to why politics has sort of royally replaced planning in transport in this day and age. Also then talk a bit about the growth that we're facing. Melbourne's probably unprecedented rates of growth in the coming years, if you believe the forecasts. And that we really do need some new approaches, and getting something sorted out to make it all work much better is long overdue. So, as I say, I think politics has really just fully replaced rational planning these days. Investment decisions are based on political promises. The announcements are made first and the business cases follow. There's no coherent transport plan for Victoria or Melbourne. We have Plan Melbourne, which talks about how big the city's going to be and roughly where people might end up living and working, but there's no transport plan to back up that and how it's all going to hang together. I don't think that Infrastructure Victoria or Infrastructure Australia have any real influence on any of this. Politicians seemingly are just ignoring their advice at the moment, and the outcomes are plenty of red herrings. I'll talk about a few of those. Lots of delays to critical things that we should be doing, and secrecy, and I think it amounts to nothing less than pork barrelling with massive amounts of public funds. It's not new, politics in transport in Australia, and in many other places around the world too. But when I first arrived in Australia in '85, I was in Perth, and I was with a company then called Travers Morgan, who were a small group of economists and transport planners, and we were looking at the electrification of the Perth rail network, and also I did a bit of work looking at what should be done to use the Mitchell Freeway, central reservation of the Mitchell Freeway, which had been set aside for transit. And we looked at bus and light rail, and the government ended up choosing heavy rail, which was really a sort of turnaround for the Perth suburban rail network. But when I arrived, the Fremantle line hadn't long been reopened after the company I worked for, Travers Morgan, had done a report suggesting that it was losing money hand over fist and it should be closed down, which they actually did. And buses were running along Stirling Highway, bendy buses, to take people between Perth and Fremantle. Then Australia won the America's Cup. Fremantle hosted the next round, had a new lease of life. The next thing we knew, that the patronage on the Fremantle line, there were as many people going to work in the Fremantle direction as in the Perth direction, which was unheard of in suburban rail lines, to have as much of a destination at one end as the other. And the government had, by that stage, Brian Burke's government had reopened the Fremantle line as a political promise yet again. So in Sydney we've got a range of projects which come and go. WestConnex is the current enormous issue, and the politics that are surrounded that, in the way that the New South Wales government has sacked councils who weren't agreeing with them and done all sorts of things to push this mega project through. But there have been other projects like the North East Line and Sydney Metro, which have come and gone, and there have been political footballs thrown around. Melbourne, Chris touched on the East-West Link and the study that we did, which was Steve Brux's promise to do a study rather than commit to building the East-West Tunnel, which was Jeff Kennett's election platform. So Jeff Kennett lost and Brian Burke won that election. Then we had Brumby replace Steve Bracks, and the story goes, someone took him up in a helicopter and sort of looked at the sort of join up the dots exercise from the end of the Eastern Freeway to CityLink, and so suddenly the East-West Link was back on the agenda again. Then the next change of government, when Ted Baillieu won an election, followed the next election, and he came in on the basis of quite a lot of promises of public transport studies, including Rover Rail, Doncaster Rail, and a few other things. And they really won out at that stage. But then we had Brumby replace, we had Napthine replace Baillieu, and suddenly the East-West Link was back yet again. And you all know the more recent history of that. We also had, under Napthine, the Melbourne Rail Link idea, which was an alternative to Melbourne Metro, and the only real reason for doing that was political, because the Liberal government, I think, just didn't like Melbourne Metro because it was a Labour government idea, they thought. And the Melbourne Rail Link was put up as an alternative. It actually bypassed the city of the CBD rather than going through it. It was an incomprehensible proposal from my point of view. Then in more recent times, of course, we've had, with the cancelling of the East-West Link by the incoming Andrews government, they then promptly announced the Westgate Tunnel project, which was the Transurban proposal. And now the North East Link, we've got airport rail, we've got, again out of the blue, it seems, a proposal for a suburban rail loop. Now, that one seems to be getting a lot of positive response from transport professionals and experts and so on, but it still comes from a political process. It came from left field. It was a report done by PwC, some work done for Development Victoria. The Transport Department and the Deputy Secretary of the Planning Area of Transport knew nothing about it until it was announced. So why is transport being treated in this way? We also have, it's very clear that even though the business cases follow the announcements, it's also clear that benefit cost ratios and value for money in these projects is not being used as a criterion to help select or prioritise them. Here's a few hieroglyphics to give you some idea of some of the inconsistencies I've been finding. In public transport, we have LXRP as the Level Crossings Removals Project. That's its shorthand internally. And when the business case for that came out, it had a benefit cost ratio of 0.8. That means an 80 cent return in the dollar. Now, benefit cost ratio calculation methods are a really bent ruler. They're not very good, the calculations and the work that's done behind them, and the data and the assumptions that go into all the projections into the future and so on. So you have to take these numbers with a big pinch of salt because of the methodology behind them. But if they're all done the same way and consistent with the guidance and so on, you'd expect there would be some consistency, relative, internal consistency between the numbers. Anyway, so the Level Crossing Removals Project had a benefit cost ratio of 0.8. Now, level crossings removal and the Cranbourne-Pakenham line upgrades, EPLU, were both seen as precursors to Melbourne Metro. You need to do both those things to be able to run more trains on the line, especially the Dandenong line, before you can reap the full benefit of having the extra tunnel in the city of Melbourne Metro. All those three projects combined had a DCR of 0.9, 90 cents in the dollar, so a little bit better than level crossings by themselves. And Melbourne Metro alone had a benefit cost ratio in its business case separately of 1.1. So you can calculate what the contributing projects relatively contribute to all these numbers, and I reckon that Cranbourne-Pakenham line upgrade only has a 70 cent return in the dollar because of that. So you've got good projects propping up bad ones, apparently, if you believe these numbers. Westgate Tunnel, probably even worse. There was a lot of optimism bias. I was involved as a peer reviewer on the work that was being done for the business case and for the Westgate Tunnel. I was pretty horrified by what I found. And there was an external, I was under a contract at the Department of Transport at the time. There was an external independent peer reviewer who was also, he and I were working together, and we were both pretty horrified. When we raised our concerns, we were asked to sort of quietly go and do something else. The Westgate Tunnel, for some inexplicable reason, they added in widening the Monash Freeway on the other side of Melbourne to boost the benefits. And I reckon, and the business case said that those two projects combined, plus a few other bits and pieces, had a benefit cost ratio of 1.3. I think that was over-optimistic, and it probably was more like 0.8 if you'd done the work properly. But the Westgate Tunnel only was only about 1.1 if you dig into the numbers and try and, with a bit of detective work, I think it probably should be more like 0.7. So that means that the Monash upgrade was actually propping up the Westgate Tunnel to try and get it through as a project to give it a better benefit cost ratio overall. and I think it was all overstated anyway. And then, of course, when the East-West Link business case was finally published by the incoming Andrews government, we all discovered, I think we knew actually before, that the benefit-cost ratio for the East-West Link tunnel was actually 40 cents in the dollar return, 0.4. And the same optimism bias was in that number as was in the Westgate Tunnel. When the Andrews government started work on the Westgate Tunnel project, they brought in all the people who had just lost their jobs because the government had closed down the East-West Link, and that's all the people who were working under the Linking Melbourne Authority back then. So they all came into the Department of Transport in a team, and they brought on the same consultants that were involved in the business case for East-West Link, namely PwC and Beach Consulting with the Zenith Transport model. So it was the same team, and a lot of the mentality in that team, as we were attending meetings with them, as trying to do an independent peer review, a lot of people in that team were sort of, their mentality was, well, we didn't get that one through, we're going to try and get this one through. So in many ways, the distortions and the optimism bias, as it's called, in Westgate Tunnel was probably even worse than in the East-West Link business case, I think. I mean, I covered a few more really sort of schoolboy howlers, I suppose you could call them, in the way they were doing that work in the transport modelling and in the economic appraisal. We have, I think, an enormous policy vacuum at all levels. As I've talked about before, Plan Melbourne talks about 8 million in 2050, but there's no detail really beyond 2031, which is incidentally, as far as the government's official detailed population forecasts go, looking forwards. They only, Victoria and Future is the name of the documentation, the reports. They've produced them regularly, and they've regularly been very conservative in compared to the rate of growth at the time they were introduced. And if anything, they've stayed much lower, while Melbourne's growth has continued to accelerate. So there's no indication really about what sort of emissions, what are the air quality implications, what are the travel and mobility needs going to be as Melbourne grows to this size, what sort of vehicle mix and energy sources, and there are some fascinating new and emerging technologies in all forms of transport coming on the horizon, and none of that is really anticipated, accounted for, and policies developed for. There's no national leadership on this either. The state government is preoccupied at the moment with road projects, and toll road projects in particular, and heavy rail catch-up, and there's very little, apart from a few recent announcements, to look at really making a big difference to the people that live in areas outside the heavy rail network in Melbourne, those that have to rely on tram and bus. Trams struggle in traffic jams, and buses are, most of the bus services in Melbourne are actually below the minimum operations standards that the government says they should be at. So the bus network is really left to languish at very low levels. And there's no bipartisan approach. We've had this seesawing and footballing every time there's a change of government or a change of premier, and it just seems never ending. The future is definitely still being debated, but I think we're really slow in Australia at actually making some decisions about what we should be doing about the future. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about immigration and the rate of immigration and how that might affect population growth. We're really missing in action when it comes to energy and emissions policy. And there is some quite interesting discussion starting now on decentralisation as well. I'm not sure how far it's going to go. It may just be discussion. But alongside all of that, Melbourne just seems to be still just growing very fast, and you would probably say without any real planning and clear understanding of the implications. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, people are taking concrete steps there. Europe has a number of clear statements and policies around phasing out of fossil fuel in transport. CO2-free city mobility by 2030 in the EU. UK has proposed no new petrol or diesel vehicles by 2040. London, 80% of all trips would be by public and active transport, walking and cycling, by 2041. I've mentioned the Perth, no, it's the Perth Peel plan. Perth has grown to encompass a new area down to the south, which is called Peel. So I've changed the name of the city because it's grown so much. But one of the interesting things about Perth is the Western Australian Planning Commission, the State Planning Commission, which is probably unique in Australia. We used to have something called the Metropolitan Board of Works here, MNBW, which had a group of elected officials, and they really managed the budget for infrastructure and handled the process of developing Melbourne's infrastructure and the state's infrastructure. The WA Planning Commission has stayed in place through all of these interesting times. They're not publicly elected officials. You get on by your merit, and it's a committee representing business and industry and academia and so on, as I understand it. But I think because they do have this longevity and probably more consistency in their planning approach than anywhere else that I've seen, they're actually, although a lot would argue, me too, from starting from a low base in terms of public transport, Perth is actually probably doing a lot more and doing it a lot better than many other parts of Australia at the moment. So, talked about growth a couple of times. I've got a few graphs and diagrams, so I'll try and get across my impressions anyway of how things might turn out in the future. Now, today in Melbourne, we have, on a daily basis, we have about 16 million trips. So we've got about 5 million people. So it's just over 3 trips a day per head that we as a city generate in terms of movement. And that number has stayed pretty constant. So you can reckon that the number of trips and journeys a city will produce is about 3 and a bit times the number of people in it. And that's been fairly constant over many years. As the city grows and gets more congested, that number comes down a bit because people are discouraged from making trips they might want to. So their level of mobility is a bit compromised because of that. Anyway, a very small number of those trips are actually commutes to and from work. If you look at that, it's less than a quarter. Most of those are the other trips which people are making during the day, to and from school, shopping, and so on and so on. And as you can see in Melbourne at the moment, on a daily basis, across the whole city, about 11% of the trips are on public transport and about 5% on walking and cycling, active transport. So the vast majority of people drive, and have to drive probably in most cases. Now, bearing in mind the significance of the commutes, this next diagram will take a bit of explaining. This is, in transport we use trip matrices, which is a sort of a table that shows all the origins down one side and destinations across the top when you divide an area up into zones and to try and understand the movements. So this is Melbourne divided up into 9 or 10 areas, inner east, inner south. You can see them all down the side and across the bottom of that graph. And the height of each of those columns represents the number of trips in the morning peak. And these are trips to work, commuter trips. So as you can see, if you look at the sort of leading diagonal through the middle of that diagram, there's a lot of trips internal to each area. So if you're in the let's pick one, the northeast, the highest bar, if you go across, follow the chart across, the highest column is actually the trips that are within northeast. They're from northeast to northeast. So there's a lot of local and short trips. There's a very large number of trips in the inner area of Melbourne. Now that's not just the CBD, that's the CBD and quite a lot of the inner suburbs. And there's also large numbers of trips, if you look, this being the morning, going from all of the regions into the inner region, which is the left-hand edge, all those high columns down the left-hand edge. So that shows you, roughly speaking, how many people are going into the city, commuting into the city in the morning peak. Now, as I said before, those commuter trips are not the majority of trips by any means. They are pretty significant in the peak, though. If I add in all the other trips that happen, I'm guessing, thinking from a bit of analysis, that happen in the morning peak, just watch as I move the number of trips goes up, and most of those non-commuting trips are actually short trips, so that's why you get those really high bars within each region, if you see what I mean, each area of Melbourne. I'll just sort of toggle between the two so you can see what's happening. And if you look at the left-hand edge, the trips heading into Melbourne in the morning peak, they don't change quite so much. Now, it's that movement that determines the size of public transport in particular, because it's the largest mode share for public transport happens on that line. And that's all the rail and bus and tram trips that are going into the central area of the city. And so it's the size of that peak part of the task that determines how many train lines, how many trams and buses, and what size fleet and what sort of frequency and level of service we've got to provide to satisfy the demand, or the part of that demand that's using public transport. So it's pretty critical to setting the size of public transport in the city. Now, if everything just carries on more or less as it is now and as is forecast, and then Plan Melbourne and so on, I reckon that there'll be relatively little change in mode share, and that daily travel demand in Melbourne will just double effectively, because population is going to more or less double. There might be a slight reduction in car travel, but if you look at the capacity and the availability of all the public transport improvements that are on the shopping list at the moment, you won't see a vast change in mode share. There'll be a little bit of an increase in active transport as well. And going back to the matrix graph again, this is the last one I showed you before, all of the peak travel, but to a lower vertical scale, so that I can then just shrunk the vertical scale a bit, so I can then add in what we're going to be contending with in 2050, or whenever Melbourne reaches 8 million. It's going to look something like that. And there are vast increases in travel everywhere, but I think one of the issues that if you do some analysis of where that growth might occur, and I've done some very simplified and probably very naive assessment, just assuming in a spreadsheet, or what if we've got a certain amount of growth to accommodate 8 million people. Plan Melbourne says it's going to be X% here and X% there, spread out around the city, quite a lot of consolidation, but also quite a lot of sprawl. So I did a couple of calculations, or what if we had a consolidation version and a sort of a spreading version. And I'll come to that in a moment, because I'll show you a bit more about how Melbourne's public transport task might need to change because of that. Before I do, I'll just touch on heavy rail. So, I think heavy rail is the real mass transit. It brings the most number of people into the city, and into central Melbourne in the morning peak. 52% of people now, if you take out the workers and the large number of students that come into the city every day, you will see that 52% of people entering central Melbourne in the morning peak are actually using trains. Only another 20% using trams and buses, and the rest, I reckon, are car and active transport. So it's really heavy rail that's doing the heavy lifting. And then with a bit of crystal ball gazing, I won't go into this in too much detail, but assuming that there's a certain amount of spare capacity in some of these modes of transport and not others, and car in particular would be a big challenge to move from 50,000 people coming in the morning peak to 80, which I'm assuming 80,000. But even with all of that, if you look at, we will be nudging 500,000 trips by 2036, coming into the city. It's about 320,000 now. And by 2050 it would be up at about 700,000. But in terms of capacity, but the number of workers and students is likely to grow slightly stronger than that. So our transport problems are unlikely to go away. We will struggle to keep pace with the growth under business as usual, where central Melbourne growth continues to grow strongly as the engine room of Melbourne's economy. So we've got a few things. Chris asked me to say a few words about Metro 2. I thought I'd just illustrate for you what Metro 2 actually is. This is the next Metro rail tunnel to follow the Metro tunnel, which is now being built, due to open in 2026. It's not a very easy diagram to show you, but there's a new rail link coming down from Clifton Hill, running through via Parkville, and Chris, perhaps you can point there, coming through via Parkville and down through Flagstaff, Southern Cross, and then it goes out to Fisherman's Bend and links up with the Werribee line. It's another similar idea to Melbourne Metro, to link up a couple of key lines, free up more capacity in the loop. But Metro 2 has been on the cards, as it were, for quite a long time. It was in the Public Transport Victoria's rail network development plan that was released in 2012, although that only went as far as Fisherman's Bend. This idea to extend it further has come later. It's also born of the problem that if you were to build a rail line to Doncaster, you'd have trouble getting all those trains into the city through Jollymont. So to maintain levels of service on the Hurstbridge and Eltham, now Mernda line, you'd have to relieve pressure on the elevated section through Collingwood and so on. And that's illustrated by that. I think the Metro 2 proposal was born a little bit of that problem as well. And just so you can see how it is on a real map as opposed to a figurative diagram, it will come down with a new rail tunnel connection from Clifton Hill all the way down through under the city and out along the Fisherman's Bend, under the Yarra, I assume, not over the Yarra, at that point, to link up with the Werribee line on the other side. So it's another sort of relieving and adding of new through capacity on the network. Now, people have been talking about this for a while. There's no real planning happening on it at the moment that I'm aware of. And given the most recent announcement of the suburban rail loop, you've got to wonder. This is a map of the suburban rail loop, which was released by Development Victoria, as I said earlier on, without the knowledge of the Transport Department, we understand. It sort of embellishes the Melbourne Airport rail line proposal that links up into Sunshine. Bear in mind, this again is one of those non-to-scale cartographic exercises, so it's distorted, but it gives you an idea. To produce a rail loop that really skirts all the way around, joins up all the lines at some fairly strategic locations around Melbourne, all the way around through to Cheltenham. And the idea is that it would actually relieve the network as it goes into the city and give people options to go around instead of through the city. It's going to be horrendously expensive if it is put in tunnel as is proposed, and one of the interesting things about that particular map is it doesn't have Metro 2 on it. I'm wondering if this is put up as an option that might go ahead instead of Metro 2. There's no answers to any of these questions, it's just speculation at the moment. But the government's throwing 300 million at it, so we'll see what happens. to study it. Going back to those alternative land use features I mentioned, if you look at, as I say, simplistically looking at where the growth goes in Melbourne, without any, just assuming that it might all get centralised, or that we're somehow able to decentralise and put more jobs out to where the people are, in a big way, that all of the growth does one thing or the other. It obviously doesn't make a big difference to Melbourne as a whole. We've still got 8 million people, and we might have a bit of a change in mode share because we've got more people in the inner areas where public transport use is higher with the centralised option, and less with the decentralised option. But what's interesting, and this is my own modelling, using a pretty rough and ready modelling process, but I think it's on in the right general direction. The peak trips to inner Melbourne could change a lot with these sort of plans. So the amount of public transport we need to concentrate on getting people in and out of central Melbourne could change a lot. Now that could mean that, for example, if we were to do a lot more decentralising, that projects like the suburban rail loop may well come into their own a lot more than they would do under a business as usual future. But again, it just gives you an idea of how, if there was some sensible policy making around the shape and size of Melbourne going forwards, that the transport implications of that can be, in certain areas, pretty significant. And none of that work's being done, to my knowledge. It's not being assessed in this way. And of course, this is just if the mode shares of people in each area stay more or less as they are today, just putting more people in those areas rather than adding more transport. This is effectively what the demand for travel might be, rather than how it might be influenced by supply, if you see what I mean, the latent demand for movement. So, hopefully that gives you some idea. I've been concerned about those sort of issues quite a lot because I've done a lot of work on transport modelling and planning over many years, and I find it fascinating that no one is really, I think, coherently doing this sort of work. We see some of this work coming out of Infrastructure Victoria. The government studiously ignores what Infrastructure Victoria says, it seems to me. There are always excuses why they shouldn't follow Infrastructure Australia's advice when they're putting out their own ideas, especially in the lead up to elections. But we do need new approaches. We definitely need more mass transit, I think. Those extreme decentralised or centralised ideas I showed you, it's highly unlikely we would be able to change Melbourne's growth patterns to that extent. There are people who would be affected and disaffected all over the place, and Melbourne's growth, the amount of choice we have to be able to centralise and decentralise is not as large as I was putting in my simple spreadsheet. So I'm pretty sure that we're going to need more and more mass transit, most of it central city focused, especially the heavy rail network. We are going to need a lot of improvement to the on-road public transport, tram and bus, to get it out of traffic and just to improve the levels of service, especially on bus, and the network coverage, which is pretty woeful. We must make enable active transport to take its share, because I think it's an important, growingly an important mode, especially in the inner city areas and for shorter journeys. We can't expect that our outer suburbs, where car use is 90% plus, are going to continue to work. They're pretty dysfunctional in many ways now. We're going to see the advent of autonomous vehicles now. There's lots of discussion about this. I think the net effect might be that average car occupancy will go down because there'll be quite a few empty cars out there with no people in them running around positioning themselves for the next trip. However, people might actually use them more, so there might be some compensating there. But their impact on road capacity, some people say it might go up by half. A recent study I saw said that it might go up by 15 or 20 times, which I think is very far-fetched. But they're going to run closer together, they're going to be in platoons, they're going to move much more efficiently through traffic signals and so on and so on. Once you've got all autonomous vehicles, when there's a mixture of autonomous and human-driven cars on the network, is much more difficult. But there's a lot of steps along the way to full autonomy that could have a big effect. Definitely active transport sharing and ride sharing and so on will come of age. Uber and other things have had enormous effects on the transport choices that people have, and I'm sure that driverless transit as well, public transport, that's going to bring the cost down of mass transit. I'm talking now about mass transit rather than whether it's public or private, because out of all of this I think we may see some changes in what we currently call public transport, that is taxpayer-funded transport, as opposed to private transport, which is taxpayer self-funded transport. I think that mass transit overall will be a lot more commercially viable when it's carrying more people, and it's more efficient perhaps with driverless trains and much more efficient and automated signalling and other systems and so on. So we've got to take all those things into account, come up with new ideas. This suburban rail loop might not be a rail loop at all, it might be something, a new technology or something different. It has that sort of function, but it's not about burying heavy rail tracks into a tunnel around the city at vast expense. I'm expecting them to do something different. So I think we've got to try and come up with a new planning approach. We've got to depoliticise this system once and for all. We need to have binding targets for mode shares and capacity, and we need to, we do have the Transport Integration Act. I'm sure a number of you may have read that with some interest, and maybe not, I don't know, but it's a good read. It's got no teeth, and it's studiously ignored like many other things, it needs, its principles are there, but it's very broad brush, and there are no binding penalties or issues attached to it that give it any teeth. We definitely need to connect transport planning to land use and growth, and not have the two separate. You've got to be able to plan your growth and distribution of land use around the transport and vice versa. And we've definitely got to rethink the land use patterns across the city as well. All those new technologies and the business models behind some of them, the sharing economy and other things, they need to be anticipated, legislated for. We need long-term strategies and short-term 10-year investment plans, something that gets updated regularly, not thrown out, replaced by something else. None of these big new projects that come out of left field that suddenly change the game one at a time. And certainly the work, all of the work done for this needs to be fully audited and open to public scrutiny, and the governments have actually resisted attempts. The independent peer reviewer who worked with me on Westgate Tunnel, who I mentioned at the beginning, he also did the peer review of the Melbourne Metro business case and the modelling and forecasting attached to that. Now, he had a lot less problems with that work than he did with Westgate Tunnel. The government saw fit to release his report on Melbourne Metro, while it was heavily redacted, enormous blank spaces where there was otherwise interesting stuff to read. And, but they have consistently and steadfastly refused to release his report, despite a lot of requests through Freedom of Information and through the EES process on Westgate Tunnel. The government has spent a lot of time and lawyers' money to resist releasing that report. And I know why, because it's critical of the modelling and forecasting that was done. Yeah. And you know, so again, they do what suits them, it seems to me. So look, we need to have some clear strategic directions. We need to think about, you know, how we can maintain mobility and maintain the ability for people to move around and interact with each other, socialise, as well as interact economically and have a living as Melbourne grows. We need to think about things like moving to zero emissions and probably zero fatalities and other targets that we know as stretch targets, but a lot of those new technologies I think are going to make a big difference there. I think mass and active transport, which is what I'm calling now the greener modes of transport, should take up the majority of future growth. We probably need to end up with a mode share of more than half of our travel to be done by mass and active transport by by the time Melbourne reaches 8 million. The way we're tracking at the moment, we won't be anywhere near. And that's 4 times the amount of travel by public and active transport we have today. That's a lot. And actually it's probably more like 8 times if you take out the growth in population as well. So we can't really, without doing that, I don't think we can have any hope of keeping the road system manageable in terms of congestion. And we've got to find new ways and have new ideas as to how we're going to use that road space between the different modes of transport. Just pushing everything for low occupancy private vehicles is never going to work. That's about it.